Welcome to another deep dive with us. You've been exploring the potential of cannabinoids for things like anxiety, depression, PTSD, and, wow, some heavy research here. Scientific articles and a PhD-level podcast on cannabinoid signaling pathways, huh? You're really going deep.
It's definitely a hot topic these days, especially with all the interest in medical cannabis. We're talking about a system that's essential for how we feel and function.
Okay, so before we get into all the complexities, let's just ground ourselves in the basics for a sec.
Mm.
Most people know about THC and CBD, right? But there's a whole world of cannabinoids out there.
Absolutely. Cannabinoids are these compounds that interact with what we call the endocannabinoid system, or ECS for short. It's this incredible network in our bodies that helps keep everything balanced.
So wait a minute, our bodies actually produce their own cannabinoids.
You got it. It's true. It blew my mind when I first learned about it, too. The discovery of anandamide and 2-AG, these are two cannabinoids that our bodies naturally make. It totally changed how we understood this whole system.
That's wild. Okay, so we've got these cannabinoids, both the ones we make and the ones from outside sources, and they interact with this endocannabinoid system. But how? The podcast you sent talked about some pretty complicated signaling pathways, like my brain was doing backflips trying to follow it all.
Yeah, it gets pretty intense, but think of it this way. Those CB1 and CB2 receptors the podcast mentioned, they're like little docking stations on our cells. Cannabinoids come along, and bam, they bind to these receptors, kind of like keys fitting into locks.
Okay, so I'm picturing a cannabinoid molecule floating around, and then it finds this receptor and attaches. What happens next? Does the cell just go, hey, look what I got, and that's it?
Huh, if only it were that simple. It's more like a chain reaction. When that cannabinoid binds, it triggers a whole cascade of events inside the cell. It starts by actually changing the shape of the receptor itself.
Oh, so it's not just an on-off switch. It sets off a whole domino effect inside the cell.
Yeah.
What are some of the key players in this whole domino effect then? And how does it all affect how we, feel and function?
Well, that PhD-level podcast you shared dives into some real heavy hitters. You've got G proteins, these things called GTP and GDP, then CAMP, PKA, calcium ions. They all play their part in this cascade. Imagine a choreographed dance with each molecule hitting its mark at the right time. It's super intricate. And in the end, it all influences how our cells talk to each other and do their jobs.
Okay, I think I'm getting a bit of whiplash trying to follow all these molecules, but I'm starting to see how this whole system could be super important for mental health, right?
Absolutely. When the endocannabinoid system is in harmony, it helps regulate mood, sleep, how we respond to stress, even how we process emotions. But when it's out of whack, well, that's when things like anxiety, depression, and PTSD can start to creep in.
So you're saying cannabinoids might be able to step in, interact with the system, and help restore balance.
Bingo! That's what researchers are investigating, and the findings so far are pretty exciting. There's a lot of potential there.
All right, now we're talking. Let's shift gears and focus on those specific conditions you've been researching: anxiety, depression, and PTSD. You're interested in how cannabinoids might offer new ways to treat these, right?
Exactly. And let's start with anxiety. Some of the research you provided on CBD's potential for alleviating anxiety is really fascinating.
I remember reading about studies where CBD seemed to decrease anxiety, but I'm curious, how does it actually work in the brain? What's going on at that level?
Well, the research suggests that CBD might be working on multiple levels. It seems to interact with serotonin receptors in the brain, and those are heavily involved in regulating mood and anxiety. And there's evidence it might also influence the amygdala. And that's the part of the brain that processes fear and emotional responses. So it's like CBD is working on those very pathways that get thrown off balance when someone experiences anxiety.
It's fascinating to think about CBD calming things down right where the anxiety starts. And what's encouraging is that it seems to have a pretty good safety profile too, right?
Yeah, that's a big plus. Compared to some of those traditional anxiety medications, CBD seems to have fewer side effects. That's definitely something that makes it attractive for a lot of people.
Absolutely. Now let's dive into depression. It's a condition that affects so many people, and the treatments don't always work for everyone. What does the research say about the potential for cannabinoids to help with depression?
Well, the research on cannabinoids for depression is still pretty early, But there are some interesting leads. Some studies suggest that both THC and CBD might have antidepressant effects. It seems like they could be influencing the levels of those key neurotransmitters in the brain, like dopamine and serotonin, that play a big role in regulating mood and motivation.
So they might be able to boost those feel-good chemicals that are often depleted in depression. That makes sense. But I'm curious about the role of THC here. I remember you saying earlier that THC can have some complex effects on mood.
Yeah, it definitely can. THC's effects are dose dependent, meaning they can vary a lot depending on how much you consume. While low doses might actually have mood elevating effects for some folks, higher doses can sometimes increase anxiety or even trigger paranoia, especially in people who are prone to that.
That's a really important point. It highlights the need for more research to figure out the optimal dosages of cannabinoids for treating depression, and also to consider how individuals might respond differently to them.
Right. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. Now, shifting gears a bit to PTSD. That's a really complex disorder that often develops after experiencing trauma. You know, those intrusive memories, flashbacks, and heightened anxiety that make daily life so difficult.
Right. And I remember you mentioning that cannabinoids has sparked a lot of interest in the PTSD community. What's driving that, and what does the research say about their potential for treating those symptoms?
A lot of people with PTSD say that using cannabis, especially THC, helps ease some of their symptoms, especially nightmares and sleep problems. So that's really spurred a lot of research. But the scientific evidence is, still somewhat mixed.
Yeah, it seems like some studies show promise, but then others raise concerns. We really need more clarity on how cannabinoids are actually affecting the brain in PTSD.
Definitely. There's some research suggesting that cannabinoids might be influencing the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis. Basically, that's the body's stress response system. And we know that PTSD often involves dysregulation of the HPA axis.
So the idea is that cannabinoids could modulate the HPA axis, helping to reduce that exaggerated stress response that we often see in PTSD.
Exactly. But like you said, there are those mixed findings in the research. Some concerns have been raised about using cannabinoids for PTSD.
What are those concerns?
Well, one of the main ones is that THC, in some cases, might actually worsen certain PTSD symptoms. And in individuals who are predisposed to psychosis, it could even trigger that. It's a delicate balance, and we need to be really careful and avoid making those sweeping generalizations.
Yeah, it makes sense. We definitely need more research to really clarify both the potential benefits and risks of cannabinoids for PTSD, and especially to understand which individuals might be the most likely to benefit.
Absolutely. It highlights the need for more personalized medicine, tailoring those treatment approaches to the individual needs and vulnerabilities of each patient.
That makes a lot of sense. These disorders are so complex, and people respond so differently to treatments. We've covered a lot about the potential of cannabinoids for anxiety, depression, and PTSD, but it's really important to remember that this whole field is still in its early stages.
For sure. We need more research, more of those robust clinical trials, standardized dosages and formulations, and of course a deeper understanding of the long-term effects, both the positive and negative ones. It's important to approach this whole topic with a critical mindset. Balance the excitement with a healthy dose of caution.
Right. We need to be wary of the hype and make sure that science is guiding our decisions. So let's shift gears a bit and look at some of the challenges that researchers are facing in this field. You mentioned that the lack of standardized preparations of cannabis is a major hurdle.
Yeah, that's a big one. You see, the cannabis plant contains hundreds of different compounds, cannabinoids, terpenes, flavonoids, you name it. And the composition can vary so much depending on the strain of cannabis, the growing conditions, the extraction methods used.
So it's like comparing apples and oranges when we look at different studies that are using different cannabis preparations. It must make it incredibly difficult to compare the results across studies and draw any firm conclusions about the effects of specific cannabinoids.
Exactly. It's a major challenge that researchers are wrestling with. And another significant hurdle is that legal status of cannabis, It varies so much around the world. That makes it tough to conduct those large-scale clinical trials and can really hinder research progress.
It's a complex landscape for sure, navigating the scientific, legal, and ethical considerations around cannabinoid research. But despite all those challenges, there's still this sense of excitement and optimism in the air.
Oh, absolutely. The potential of cannabinoids to address unmet needs in mental health is vast, and the research is progressing rapidly. We're on the verge of a new era in understanding the endocannabinoid system and all its therapeutic possibilities.
It feels like we're explorers charting a new frontier, each discovery leading to new possibilities. What are some of the most exciting frontiers that you see in this field? What are researchers looking at for the future of cannabinoid-based therapies?
Well, one area that's really exciting is the development of those pharmaceutical-grade cannabinoid medications.
Oh, so actual prescription medications specifically designed to target these conditions.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond traditional cannabis use, like smoking or edibles, and developing those precise, standardized medications derived from specific cannabinoids.
Okay, are there any examples of those medications that are already available or in development?
There are already a few cannabinoid-based medications that have been approved for certain conditions. For example, dronabinol, that's a synthetic THC analog. It's shown some promise in treating anxiety in certain patients. And there's a ton of ongoing research into using CBD for different anxiety disorders.
That's great to hear. What about depression? Any cannabinoid-based medications on the horizon for that?
Not an FDA-approved one specifically for depression yet, but there are quite a few clinical trials underway investigating the potential of both THC and CBD. Some researchers are thinking that a combination of the two might be particularly effective, leveraging what's called the entourage effect.
I've heard that term before, the entourage effect.
Yeah.
What exactly is that, and why is it so important in this context?
The entourage effect basically refers to the idea that different cannabinoids and other compounds in the cannabis plant can actually work together synergistically, meaning they enhance each other's therapeutic effects when taken together.
So it's like a team effort, each cannabinoid playing its part, but together they achieve something greater than the sum of their individual contributions. Interesting.
It is, and it's driving a lot of research into identifying the optimal combinations of cannabinoids for specific conditions.
Okay, what other promising areas of research are there in cannabinoid-based therapies? What else is coming down the pipeline?
Another exciting area is the development of those novel drug delivery systems for cannabinoids, going beyond those traditional methods like smoking or ingesting edibles.
So more targeted and controlled ways of delivering these compounds to the body.
Right on. Researchers are looking into things like transdermal patches, nasal sprays, even targeted delivery systems that could deliver cannabinoids directly to specific brain regions.
Wow, that sounds almost like science fiction.
It's cutting-edge stuff, for sure, and it holds a lot of potential to revolutionize how we use cannabinoids for therapy. It could lead to more precise dosing, fewer side effects, and potentially even greater effectiveness.
The possibilities are mind-blowing. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm feeling a mix of excitement and awe at the sheer potential of cannabinoids in mental health.
Right.
But also recognizing the need for caution and continued research to make sure we're harnessing this potential responsibly and ethically.
You've nailed it. We need to balance the enthusiasm with a healthy dose of scientific rigor, making sure that our decisions are always guided by evidence and a commitment to patient safety. But there's no doubt that the future of cannabinoids in mental health is incredibly bright.
So what's next on our journey? Where do we go from here?
Well, let's shift our focus from the general to the specific. We've talked a lot about the broad potential of cannabinoids for mental health. Now, let's take a closer look at some real-world examples of how this potential is actually being translated into therapies.
I'm definitely ready to dive into those specifics. Let's see how this research is making a difference in people's lives. Join us for the final part of this deep dive, where we'll explore how these discoveries are shaping the future of mental health treatment. All right, we're back for the final part of our cannabinoid deep dive. We've talked about the science, the potential, the challenges. Now, let's see how all of this translates into real-world therapies.
Right, time to move from the lab to the clinic. Let's explore how cannabinoids are being used to actually develop new therapies for anxiety, depression, PTSD.
You mentioned earlier that pharmaceutical companies are developing cannabinoid-based medications. What are some examples of those, and how are they different from just using, traditional cannabis?
Precision is key. Instead of using whole cannabis flower or extracts, which can be all over the place in terms of potency and what's actually in them, these meditations use isolated or synthetic cannabinoids, and they're given in very precise doses.
So it's like, instead of using a plant extract for a headache, you take a specific pain reliever that targets that headache.
That's a great analogy. It's all about creating treatments that are reliable and predictable, tailored to specific conditions and doses.
Makes sense, especially with mental health, where finding the right balance is so crucial. So specifically, what kind of cannabinoid medications are they working on for anxiety?
Well, one example is Epidiolex. It's a CBD-based medication that's already approved for certain types of epilepsy, but it's also being investigated for anxiety disorders.
Okay.
And then you've got synthetic cannabinoids like dronabinol, which we touched on earlier. That one seems to interact with the endocannabinoid system in a way that could reduce anxiety.
You sent over a study about social anxiety disorder and CBD. That seems really promising.
It is. That study found that CBD significantly reduced anxiety symptoms in folks with social anxiety disorder. And what's really interesting is that it seemed to work not only during the actual social situation, but also before, reducing that anticipatory anxiety, that dread leading up to it.
That's huge. For anyone with social anxiety, knowing that CBD might help manage both the anticipation and the experience itself, well, that could be life-changing.
Exactly. And since CBD usually has a milder side effect profile compared to some of those traditional anti-anxiety meds, it could be a great option for people who haven't had success with other treatments.
What about depression? Are there any cannabinoid medications in the works for that?
Nothing specifically approved for depression just yet, but there's tons of research happening. Some studies are looking at just CBD, while others are exploring combinations of CBD and THC.
So using both.
Yeah. The idea is that THC in very controlled doses might help boost mood and motivation, while CBD could sort of balance things out to reduce any anxiety or negative side effects that might come with the THC.
So it's about finding that sweet spot between the two compounds to create a treatment for depression that's both effective and well-tolerated.
Right, and that's where the entourage effect that we talked about earlier comes into play. There's more and more evidence suggesting that the combination of different cannabinoids, along with those other plant compounds, might be more beneficial than just using isolated compounds by themselves.
Now, PTSD. That one's generated a ton of interest in cannabinoid therapies. What are some of the ways researchers are exploring cannabinoids for PTSD?
One area they're focusing on is using cannabinoids to manage those sleep disturbances and nightmares that are so common with PTSD. THC, in particular, seems to have some potential for reducing nightmares and improving sleep quality.
So helping people with PTSD get more restful sleep, which is obviously crucial for healing and recovery.
Absolutely. And beyond sleep, there's research looking at whether cannabinoids can help reduce how intense those flashbacks and intrusive memories are, and also maybe even dampen that hyperarousal and anxiety that often comes with PTSD.
It seems like they're exploring multiple angles to target the different aspects of this complex disorder.
Exactly. And remember, PTSD manifests differently in everyone. Some people might struggle mostly with nightmares, while others have debilitating anxiety or flashbacks. The hope is that with more research, we'll be able to really tailor those cannabinoid therapies to address the unique needs of each individual.
So personalized medicine is key here, like you mentioned before.
It is. It's not about a one-size-fits-all approach. It's about understanding how to use those different cannabinoids to create individualized treatment plans.
That makes a lot of sense. We've talked about medications, but what about other forms of cannabinoid therapies? Are there any cool new developments happening in how these compounds are being delivered?
For sure. One area that's super exciting is the development of those new drug delivery systems that we talked about before. Imagine, instead of smoking or taking edibles, you could use a transdermal patch that delivers a precise dose of CBD over a long period.
So you get the benefits of cannabinoids without having to smoke or worry about the psychoactive effects of THC. Or for folks who just need a consistent, longer-term delivery method.
Exactly. There's also research into things like nasal sprays, which work faster than edibles, and even those targeted delivery systems that could deliver cannabinoids directly to specific areas of the brain.
Wow, the future is now. It's amazing to think about all the possibilities that are opening up in this field. So, as we wrap up our deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listener will walk away with?
First and foremost, the endocannabinoid system is not some obscure thing. It's a fundamental part of human biology, and it plays a huge role in regulating mood, sleep, stress response, you name it.
And cannabinoids, whether they're from outside sources like cannabis or naturally produced within our bodies, have the power to really influence this system in some amazing ways, opening up these new possibilities for treating all sorts of mental health conditions.
Right. And while the research is still ongoing, what we've seen so far is incredibly promising. Cannabinoid-based therapies are emerging as a potential game changer for conditions like anxiety, depression, and PTSD. They're offering real hope for folks who haven't found relief with traditional treatments.
But it's important to remember, this is still a young field. We need more research to really nail down those long-term effects, the best dosages, and how to best personalize these therapies.
We need to approach this with both enthusiasm and caution, making sure that good science guides our choices and that we always put the safety and well-being of patients first.
Well said. To our listener, we hope this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for the amazing world of cannabinoids and their potential to revolutionize how we approach mental health treatment. Keep exploring, Keep asking those questions and stay tuned for more exciting developments in this field. It's going to be an incredible journey.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for joining us.